Hello, and welcome to the Higher Aim of Art. Peter Trippi has edited Fine Art Connoisseur since 2006. Previously, he directed New York's Dahesh Museum of Art, which specialized in 19th century European academic painting and sculpture. In 2002, Phaidon Press published Trippi's monograph, J.W. Waterhouse, which reassesses the Victorian painter best known for his Lady of Shalott in Tate Britain. On Friday, April 5th, Studio Incominati was delighted to welcome Peter to speak about J.W. Waterhouse in his lecture entitled Painting, Poetry, and the Occult, J.W. Waterhouse's Thematic Inspirations.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Dan. And thank you, everybody, for being so hospitable. It's great to be back in Philadelphia. I live in New York. But it's just the energy that you feel in an art school is exciting. I work in my home office on the magazine Fine Art Connoisseur, and so I'm a little disconnected from art making. And I love seeing artists who are doing things, and I love talking about great artists of the past who are inspirations to us all today. And so what I'd like to do is sort of turn my attention to one of my favorites, J.W. Waterhouse, and tell you a bit more about him, the man, and in particular about the ideas, the literature that he was inspired by, and that informed the art he made that we love today. And so any questions you have, I'm happy to answer them after. If you have something urgent to ask during the talk, that's fine too. I'm not offended. The title that Dan and I agreed on is Painting, Poetry, and the Occult, J.W. Waterhouse's Thematic Inspirations. Next, please. This is the man himself. J.W. Waterhouse was born in 1849. He died in 1917. And just to put that into context, 1849 was the heart of the Victorian period. He was born to an English father and a Scottish mother in Rome. They were both artists, his parents, and they were living in Rome. And Rome was just about to get into some serious trouble with a war. And so the family moved to the countryside and finally left Italy in 1854 when little John William Waterhouse was 5. They went back to Britain, their native land. So in fact, he grew up primarily in London. But he was always infused with the spirit of Italy, and you'll learn more about that as we go. His nickname was Nino, little boy, and we have a feeling that he spoke Italian, that he went back to Italy so often that chances are he actually had kept some Italian language from his youth. This is him in his maturity. He's in his 30s at this point, very dashing, but we don't know much about him, and that's where it gets interesting, that he seems to have been rather shy or retiring in a way that some of his equally successful peers were not. And that means that we have to read him through his art more than through his letters or through accounts of what other people said about him. And that's kind of weird, given how well documented the period was, this Victorian period in which he lived. Next, please. This is him at work in his studio. Now, of course, this is a posed shot, right? He's in a suit, for heaven's sake. I mean, he's not really painting. He's just pretending to paint. But what I love about this image, when he's in his 40s, is that he is at work on an oil sketch of the Lady of Shalott, one of his favorite themes. We'll talk about that later. But look at the Venus de Milo above him on the cabinet. Now, every 19th century artist had a plaster cast of the Venus de Milo there by him or her, because this was a touchstone. And this, I think, is a very important reminder that classicism was always looming in the background for Waterhouse and his generation, that they were very interested in ancient Greece and ancient Rome because this was something that they had grown up with in every way. And I'll talk more about that, being steeped in classicism through literature, through ideas, through art, through travel. This is a very interesting juxtaposition. Next, please. This is him showing off paintings that he's made, which were sold to a rich man. This is when he's just about approaching 50. This is in his studio, of course, just before the works of art are going off to be exhibited. And you see a sense of scale. I'm sorry that these slides that I'm to show you today don't really convey how large the pictures are, because they're all on the same screen. So you can see that this one in particular, Flora and the Zephyrs, is pretty large. So we have to remember that as we're looking at the color slides that I put together. Next, please. So coming back to this image, the notion of a gentleman, that in the 19th century, it was very much a journey for working artists to go from artisan or tradesperson to gentleman or lady in a few cases. Women were not nearly as well represented in the professional art world as they should have been. This idea of the suit, of being someone who thinks as much as paints, is very important. That there was this awareness that the artist could be an intellectual of sorts, and Waterhouse was very definitely respected for his poetic sensibilities. Not that he wrote poetry, but people wrote in the literature, in the newspapers, in the magazines. This is a painter's painter when it comes to technique, and he's also a poetic painter, that he's clearly reading poetry and other historic literature in a very insightful way, and he's translating that passion to the canvas. And I think that's something we want to celebrate. Next. Yeah. So it all begins a bit ropey like this, as often is the case. He was very young, 20, when this picture was made. I actually think that it's a partnership between Waterhouse and his father. His father, William, was not very good, and this is a very kind of, second-tier neoclassical picture. It's all about a heroic figure, Cochle's. We see a kind of stylized Grecian city, possibly Athenian, in the background, but actually it's a Roman hero. But, it's all a bit of a mishmash. The idea here of the father being entranced by ancient Italy and Greece, having brought his family there. He was independently wealthy, he had a wealthy manufacturer father, means that this was something that the boy grew up in, that this kind of awareness of the heroics of Republican Rome meant something to him, and so he is going at it here in his youth. This is before he arrives at the Royal Academy schools in London to be trained more formally. Next, please. This is where he's trained. This room still exists inside the Royal Academy in London. They've just done a big expansion, but they kept this room safe. It was this very room where young Waterhouse in the 1870s sat side by side with some other Victorian greats, or greats to be, and were shown how to draw from the live model, as you do here. This is exciting to me because this is a reminder of the word academy in the middle of the name of the institution. The Royal Academy today is famous as a kind of museum. There's lots of exhibitions popping up. There is still a school inside, but it's a little more groovy, a little bit more do what you feel. And in fact, the origins were much more skewing toward what you do here at Incominati, that there was a lot of rigor, and there was a real interest in the figure, and of course in anatomy and the classical past and so on. I think it's important to note these casts, which were everywhere, not just in the home of the artist, but also in the school of the artist, that they were constantly consulting these casts, just as you do today. Next. Another view of that space, which is quite magical and very untouched. It hasn't been ruined by modernization. So I'm sure you recognize a lot of these motifs. Next. So as you would expect, Waterhouse in his 20s was sketching from statuary, and he was also sketching from the live model. And in this case, it's a group of sketchbooks that came down through his family, which were donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum by his descendant, who was in fact a curator at the V&A. And this is a wonderful resource for us to see exactly how he grew as a draftsman through his career. Next, please. This is a reminder of how good he got. This is much, much, much later in his career, early 20th century. The picture, you'll see the finished version. There are two in a minute. I don't mean to bore you with the narrative right now, but you can see that this man knows what he's doing with the female figure. He did have a thing for young women, i.e. he preferred to paint them, but I think part of that is the poetry that he was gravitating toward. There is no indication that he was doing anything untoward with those female models, but you'll see again and again the same face or faces in the mature work. And there is a bit of speculation about whether there was a kind of muse. He was married to a woman artist, and that marriage lasted a very long time. In fact, they were still married when he passed. So we don't know what exactly the story is. It would seem as if some of Waterhouse's papers, letters, and so on were destroyed or lost at some point. But that could be that that was the nature of the widow. She was perhaps a private person who didn't want stuff going out into the world. We don't know. Next slide, please. So I showed you, in fact, this oil sketch on the easel in the earlier photograph. This is a reminder of his technique, that basically, no surprise to you, he's working in a sketchbook, then he's working on a big sheet with charcoal, and then he's going to the oil sketch. He is thinking very carefully about his compositions before he goes at them full tilt. However, no matter how he's working, and this is at a very large scale, he is still going to be making changes once he gets to the, quote, final version. If you'll just move along, please, to the next slide. This is research I did with a conservator in London looking at a privately owned painting, Lamia. I'll show you the slide of the finished version later, but right now, trust me, the conservator went ahead and did a line drawing of the finished composition, a girl kneeling before a man. And what she found, these passages of red that she's marked on the drawing, these are areas of very significant change. And he had already done drawings and oil sketches before he went to the final version. So he was constantly changing his mind as he worked, and these are passages that indicate a bit of change. To call them pentimenti is not quite right, because actually they don't necessarily show through. The conservator was working with microscopic pigment samples, looking at layering. In a few cases, we find paintings that have up to 25 layers of paint. There's a richness of the surface, which I wish I could share with you in these slides. That's not going to happen. Maybe you get a taste of it in some of these beautiful brush strokes. But this was a man who loved oil paint, and he was relishing it, but he was also making his clients and dealers crazy, because he was always slowing down to make it just that much better. And he was notorious for missing deadlines, for exhibiting his work, that he would sort of rush the work in still wet to the Royal Academy for the summer exhibition because he had been slow getting it done. But I think we all can understand procrastination. Next, please. So, going back to the beginning, I showed you that rather awful Death of Cockley's picture that he might have made with his father. This is rather in the same spirit. It's not very convincing as a figure. I'm showing it to you not because it's a great painting. I wanted to zoom in on this detail of the figure, but it's really about the fact that it's Miranda. Miranda, the female heroine of The Tempest. There's something very powerful going on throughout Waterhouse's career with Miranda, whose name means wonder. And also, let's remember, the artist is Waterhouse. I do believe that he's interested in water, the element of water, because he comes back to it again and again, and I'll talk a bit about that later. This is a very unconvincing rendition of the girl looking out to sea, as she does in the play by Shakespeare, but that's another thing. If we go forward, please. This is a much finer rendition from not that long after. I would say that within 5 years, he's made really good strides in his technique. This is clearly a picture which melds the naturalism of John Brett, who was a Ruskinian landscape painter, the idea of a very naturalistic evocation of water and rock, but also that figure is clad in these Parthenon-style draperies. And clearly he's been looking at the British Museum, and he's been talking to people like Frederick Leighton or Albert Moore, who were peers, who were fascinated by the drapery that we see in the Parthenon marbles at the British Museum, which was right up the road from where Waterhouse was living. I should add that he was very much a Londoner. He was there all his life. He traveled widely in Italy, but he did always live in London. Next, please. close-up, just to give you a sense of his technique in the mid-1870s. So he's about 25, 26 years old at this point. Next. And then Miranda, at the very end of his life, literally the year before he passes, he makes this picture, which of course is much more cinematic. Not a surprise because movies were now existing. You could go to the films, to the movie house, so that doesn't throw us too much. But the idea here of a very different approach to water, of course, and this, what we might call signature style of Waterhouse with the long red-haired girl and the beautifully colored gown. Certainly not in any way looking like Athens now, looking much more like the period in which the Tempest is ostensibly set. So, next please. Coming back to the mid-1870s, he is fascinated by ancient legend and myth. And this is something that he's grown up with through his birth in Rome, through his classical education. We don't know exactly which high school he went to, but we sort of think we know. He certainly would have been taught Latin and Greek as a boy, and he would be therefore interested in the exciting stories like the death of Cocles, but also this motif from antiquity, sleep, and his half-brother, death. And so he goes and makes a picture of it. Quite unusual for an English artist to be doing this, especially in the 1870s. Let's face it, it's quite melancholy. And what's that all about? One could argue that the pictures I'm about to show you, the very melancholy pictures of the 1870s, are informed by the passing of his own mother from tuberculosis in the 1850s. This was a very common disease at that time, and a very difficult one to watch unfold, where sleep could easily become death in a patient. And also, he did lose other siblings. So this was, unfortunately, an era of high mortality, even among grown-ups, let alone infants. So this may have been very much on his mind, this idea of the ephemerality of life. It's quite possible. This is certainly suggesting not only a kind of a melancholy spirit in him, but he is clearly looking at Lawrence Alma Tottemo. Dan mentioned that I've worked on Tottemo too. You probably know Tattemo's work, and I'll show you an example shortly. I'll be more clear about why. Next slide, please. This is Waterhouse. This is a wonderful evocation of the aftermath of a party. The boy and the girl are resting, having been dancing and entertaining the guests, and there's this kind of quiet moment where a waitress is listening to the last of the music being played by the band. What's really relevant here is that behind the children is a funeral procession in a relief mosaic. That is clearly an idea of even the young, the beautiful with the rosy cheeks will die. And that is, an age-old trope, that life is short, and that we should enjoy it while we can. Please notice in particular the fact that this is not a bad slide. This is cut off halfway over here. That is very Alma Tottemo. This is the era of photography. Everybody has got a little camera. And so it's very normal for artists of this generation to think about cropping to give us a sense of life, that life as it happens, not a formal neoclassical composition with perfect symmetry. It is sliced off because that's the way we actually look. Next slide, please. And this is Alma Tottemo himself. The reason I'm bringing him up is that he is 15 years older than Waterhouse, and he's a rock star in the 1870s in London. So Tottemo is naturally someone that young Waterhouse would admire. He's interested in classicism. This is a bit of a melancholy picture itself. It's the same period. This older man is eyeing up the younger girl. Presumably they're engaged, and something is about to happen. So between hope and fear. It is not classically pretty. There's a little bit of an edge to this, and the viewers would have known that. And I think Waterhouse would be interested in that. Please notice the attention to specificity, that these are actual antique objects from the British Museum or from Tattemo's own collection. He collected antiquities. And so it's relevant because he's trying to make the idea of palpability present to the viewer, that this actually could have happened. That's an actual wall painting from the Mediterranean. And so Tottemo is bringing that archaeology into a picture that is otherwise, frankly, a potboiler. It's a bit melodramatic, isn't it? I mean, this is all a bit soap opera. Next slide, please. And so this immediacy comes right back into play with these objects. That young Waterhouse is also going to the British Museum and sketching and drawing, and maybe even using photographs to record artifacts from the ancient world to make this scene look even more real. Fine, no problem. He is interested in the wonder of Pompeii. As you surely know, Pompeii, the excavations began in the 18th century, and artists were going more and more to look around at the new digs that were occurring, and they couldn't believe their eyes because they had grown up reading classical stories, and now Pompeii was showing them how Rome actually had looked, or a Roman city anyway. So these colors, of course, were accurate to the period, and that was something that wasn't necessarily known much longer before. In this case, we have a sick child brought to the temple of the healing god of medicine. Well, that's a morbid subject for a man who's not even 30. What's that all about? Again, illness in his family. I have a feeling that this was a theme that really moved him, and indeed it moved other people. The picture is absolutely enormous. It's much larger than the screen right here. Next, please. A close-up, just to give you a sense of his mastery of paint and details. Next. Again, really wonderful handling of metalwork, always from this date on, really virtuosic. And he gets a lot of that from Alma Tottemo, who is, out there doing great examples himself. Next. A close-up of the mother and child. Again, a little melodramatic, not really our taste today, perhaps, but nonetheless of great interest to the Victorians, who were big on sentiment, as you probably know. Next. This is where he's working, not living here, but working here in a purpose-built studio house that still exists today in London. Next. And then just along the courtyard, the next one that he and his new wife move into. She's a flower painter. She doesn't seem to exhibit much after they marry. Unfortunately, that was often the case in the Victorian period, that the wife would stand back and let the husband shine, and she would perhaps support him with all the paperwork of running a business. It's also possible that she was a theater critic, but we don't know. What's enigmatic about this couple is that they were living in the middle of this bohemian enclave, and he was a rising star in the Royal Academy, but they had no children, and they never had a really grand house. Next slide, please. This is where they ultimately moved, but you might think that looks very grand, but they actually only had one section of this building, not the entirety. Now, with no children, that's fair enough, but really the action was here in the studio complex at the back, not so much the public rooms. They're really not that large or impressive. The house has been changed since this photograph was taken, unfortunately. But I think there's clearly a couple who love to travel and also are really immersed in art or arts, and not necessarily in the big social world that many other artists were enjoying. Next. An example of a decorative picture. This is obviously something in the way of an idyll, just a girl playing with white feathers from her fan. And the verticality is quite wonderful. This is very much an homage to Alma Tottemo. We're looking through the curtain into a courtyard full of sunflowers, which was the symbol of the aesthetic movement. Oscar Wilde was very closely associated with sunflowers, and she's got sunflowers right here in her vase. So it's a beautiful little jewel of a painting. Next. More melancholy. Now, you love the ancient past, you love the stories of history. Why on earth would you depict Nero feeling sad after he's had his mother knocked off? It's a weird subject. Now, I'm not suggesting Waterhouse killed his mother, but it is something odd, and that oddness is intriguing. And the critics were fascinated. Like, why is this young man, who is at this point not quite 30, doing this? But it is a striking composition. Obviously, that red is very memorable. It really grabs your attention. And also this cutoff of the sculpture behind the portrait statue is coming back to that photography feeling. That this is something in the way of a close look at a grief-stricken person, and we're on the move here. We're not actually looking at him in any kind of symmetrical, formal way. Next, please. This is also enormous, as the previous one was, and a really peculiar subject. Diogenes, the Athenian philosopher, who was a cynic, which means that he was, well, he hated everybody, and he lived in a barrel in the middle of town, and he just thought, stop bothering me. These women, who are basically statues come to life, are promenading with their beautiful clothing on the staircase, and it's this contrast between the sort of really hideous old man and the beautiful women who don't look especially Greek, in my opinion. They look a little bit northern here. That virtuosity, that he can pull this off, keep it all together, make a little pun, because the philosopher in history would complain that people were standing in his sunlight, that he wanted the light to fall on him, and of course she's leaning over, and she's now creating a shadow that falls upon him. This notion of the staircase, using it as a compositional tool, is also borrowed from Alma Tottemo. So he's very much a follower at this point. He's not really leading, but he's got a little bit of an edge to him that makes people wonder, who is this guy? What's he thinking? He's taking the classical stories and turning them slightly askew, and we rather like that. Next slide, please. To prove that point, here is a very similar painting by Waterhouse hanging in a very prestigious position at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition. This is the big opening party with all the elite of Victorian Britain, and that is Waterhouse's painting right next to the portrait of the recently deceased Prime Minister Disraeli. Not bad, for a kid who is just barely 30 to be hanging in such a position. Something is respected. He's a good painter, but he's also a kind of interesting character artistically, and that is noticed. Next. Now it starts getting weirder. In the early 1880s, he's still thinking about oddball subjects from the classical past. Late in the history of the Roman Empire, there was the Emperor Honorius. He was hopeless in every way. He couldn't make any decisions, and he actually lost part of the empire to the barbarians. This is a scene where he is feeding his pigeons, because he prefers pigeons to people, and his courtiers are bowing, like, oh, please, sir, make a decision. Can we bring you a gift? It is truly decadence for the Roman Empire. This is the downward for the Roman Empire. But notice the brilliant composition. He really struggled with this to try and convey physically what he needed to communicate about this really debauched, lazy, stupid young man. These figures are in a kind of semicircle, and even the birds are arranged in such a way that our eye ultimately moves to him. Now, if you'll please advance to the next slide, we have another semicircle coming the year after. So Waterhouse has found himself a motif that really works, a strategy, a semicircle of hysterical women listening to a priestess who herself is listening to a shrunken head. There's a human head. Here, this is from ancient Hebrew tradition. It's an oral tradition. I mean, there's no proof that this kind of mysticism existed, but chances are something like it existed in the ancient Middle East. They're listening to her make prophecies, and they are responding in different ways. They're grief-stricken, or they're happy, or waiting, or whatever. So it is melodramatic in that sense, but it is extremely watchable. And this picture got Waterhouse a lot of interest because it was so exotic and strange and actually not very classical at all. It is certainly aware of history, though, because he's got all these meticulously painted details from the Middle East, historical and contemporary. Next, please. And then we have an amazing run of hit pictures, very large pictures. All of these happen to be now at Tate Britain in London, so you can see them there. I'll walk through each one of them, but you can see to a certain extent how he's evolving. These are long-haired women with interesting lives, and that is inherently watchable for the public, but he's also playing with different painting styles. And this is year to year. Please notice the years, that he is really on at this point. He's now in his, he's approaching 40, and he's really hot, not just as a kind of seller, but also as a kind of experimenter with style. Next, please. This picture is quite fascinating. It's based on an account from late Rome. This is in the Spanish province, Iberia. And essentially, we're told that a young woman wanted to worship the Christian God and not the Roman gods, and so she is killed by the Roman authorities to prevent this spreading of Christianity as an idea. And when her body falls to the ground, she's dead, and the snow begins to fall. Well, it's not supposed to be snowing in this part of Spain in August. And so clearly the crowds in the background have recognized a miracle. What's so extraordinary about this is not only the quoting of ancient art, Renaissance art, Mantegna, and so on, the idea of a complete command of this perspective of the body, but also the unusual vista that slices us back to the forum in the distance and the figures gathering in shock because the snow is falling at a time of year when it's not supposed to be. Even if we were able to get close, the face of the centurion who's watching guard is looking slightly askew, like, what the hell is going on? This is something momentous. This young woman must be of God, and indeed she's a saint. So it is a truly extraordinary picture for a Protestant Englishman to be showing in 1885 in London, and it gets a lot of attention. So it is very much aware of history, because this supposedly actually happened, but it's also quite supernatural. There is something magical and miraculous and weird happening. Literally, the story goes, that a white dove emerges from the girl's mouth and flies to God. Now, we don't see something disgusting like a bird coming out of her mouth, but we do see birds flapping up. Here, I think you can make them out, here and there. Something is going on, and we are brought into that world by Waterhouse. Next. Of course, he's thinking as well about the great French artist Gérôme, who was a worldwide superstar at this time. This is an earlier picture where we have a figure seen from the head down, begging for life. This kind of picture was reproduced across the world, and in fact, Gérôme lived in London in the 1870s, so it's not a surprise that Waterhouse would be thinking about Gérôme every now and then. Next. And good old Gérôme and his martyrdoms, he was making them like crazy from the 1860s onward. That kind of gruesomeness was associated with France. The British were not supposed to be doing that. And so the British critics said of Waterhouse, he paints like a Frenchman. This is a little weird. We're not sure we like it, but it is interesting. So he kind of knows when to quit. I think you'll agree that the picture of Saint Eulalia is quite chaste. It's not disgusting. In this case, it is revolting. The Frenchman shows us bodies on fire. They're literally on those posts, and they are burning to death, and these Christians are about to be consumed by the lions. It's gross. We don't have that in England because he would literally be deported if he had done that as an Englishman. Next. Clearly, martyrdoms were on the mind of a lot of people, and there was, in fact, a religious revival going on in England. This is an artist that we've never heard of since, but it's a very fine and very famous picture of the 1880s of another Christian getting, well, actually, it's the other way around. She's a non-Christian, and she's getting killed by Christians. Next. And then we come to this middle picture in my earlier slide, the magic circle. Now, talk about the supernatural. This is a situation where, according to the critics, and we don't actually have Waterhouse's word for this, but we think it's probably right, he's imagining a witch who is concocting some sort of potion. She's drawing the magic circle. Outside the circle are the black birds that are obviously quite doomy. They're afraid to go inside. She's holding a Celtic knife, which is used to cut magical herbs. And this is probably set in the Solfatara, which is a volcanic area west of Naples. So it's got all of these very kooky, spooky aspects to it. She's got herbs in her at her waist, and she also has a snake around her neck. The Ouroboros is the endless snake that eats its own tail, which is a symbol of everlasting life and death. This is something that was a closely associated aspect of theosophy, which was a newly emergent spirituality. Madame Blavatsky was a worldwide sensation, and she was preaching a kind of mysticism that drew on ancient and contemporary religions from around the world, including India. So this is very edgy stuff. This is not just your average witch. This is someone with an edge. And the fact that the British are celebrating this, that it was actually purchased for Britain by a committee, and that's why it's now in the National Collection, kind of amazing that this is getting such success. Next, please. Well, for sure, the painting technique, that kind of very diffuse landscape that we just saw, is being borrowed from the rock star Jules Bastien-Lepage. He was dead in 1884. There's nothing like early death to make your career hot. I don't recommend it to you, but it is something that has always been true. If you're really, really good and you die young, wow, everybody talks. You probably know this painting from the Metropolitan Museum. This is a picture that is similar in the sense that we have a very photographic-like figure in the middle, and then a very impressionistic handling of landscape. And as you probably know, there are three magical figures hovering in the trees. Joan is listening to the saints in the trees. So it's a weird, wonderful picture, which was an absolute sensation across the world in 1879 when it was premiered. So Waterhouse is definitely paying attention to this. He's aware of modern French art, and he's applying it to his own purposes. Magic Circle is relevant because the witch is very photographic-like in her flesh handling. Next. And of course, that whole witchy thing is going on in British culture, but in a much more genteel way. Medea, a woman who poisons her own children, is depicted here 20 years earlier by Frederick Sands. Next. And Sands also depicts the medieval witch, Morgan Le Fay, who is in the Arthurian narrative. Next. And of course, Waterhouse can't resist doing his own Medea, but that's much later. Here she is with the magical potion as Jason watches in fear. Next. Waterhouse does something rather interesting. He does one massively large picture that is successful, but it's not quite him. He's playing with all these styles, isn't he? He's thinking about France from all different angles, modern French art. And so he does this picture of a doomed queen in the ancient Middle East, Mariamne. She's married to one of the Herods, and Herod's sister has turned her brother against his own wife, and now she's being banished off to death. She's going to be killed shortly. Again, we have a semicircle of judges who are watching. They are powerless to do anything to stop this execution, even though she is wearing white. She is innocent. Now, it's a massive theatrical picture, and it's very effective, but Waterhouse doesn't quite go this road much longer. Please notice the intense interest in archaeology continues. He's still looking at artifacts in the museum and bringing them into his paintings. Next. Close-up of that wonderful lion. Next. Well, suddenly, all of London is going crazy over a retrospective about John Everett Millais, the great Pre-Raphaelite. You probably know Rossetti, Holman Hunt, and Millais, the original Pre-Raphaelites. This picture is the star of the Millais show in 1886. Everyone says, my God, you were so good when you were young. What happened to you now? Because Millais is still working at this point. Ophelia, of course, is the victim in Hamlet, and here she is singing as she dies, as she's drowning. This idea of intense nature surrounding her, that she is going back into nature as a kind of singing flower. As you know, she's weaving flowers as a crown in the story by Shakespeare. That is something that one never forgets. This is one of the most famous paintings in the world because it is so haunting. Next. Well, Waterhouse decides he'll have a go. He turns to Tennyson, the great Victorian poet, and in particular to the story of the Lady of Shalott. Now, the Lady of Shalott is actually an Italian tale that Tennyson retold in the 1830s. Everyone in Victorian Britain could recite the Lady of Shalott. We have to remember this is an era when the sun goes down, it's you, your candle, and your book. That's all you got. No TV, no internet, no movies. It's all about reading. You read to each other, you might play music to each other, and now you go to bed. So Victorian poetry is very personal to that generation because this is stuff they read again and again, and they live it in terms of their imagining of what might the Lady of Shalott have looked like. Waterhouse gives us the long red hair that we saw in Ophelia, and he also is giving us this very lush English landscape. But of course, he's also giving us that extraordinary face that he borrows from Mariamne. It's the same model. The queen going down the stairs has now been converted into a medieval heroine, a victim, another kind of victim. And here she is singing as she pulls the boat away. She will die in the boat sailing down the river. This is a very important episode from the Arthurian legends, and Tennyson told the story very beautifully in verse. So this is a turning point for Waterhouse. Not yet have you heard me mention a deep interest in the medieval heritage. Now we see it coming into view. And so this mixing of Middle Ages and classicism is very distinctive to Waterhouse, and we're going to see it going again and again. Next, please. It's coming from the legacy of the Pre-Raphaelites, of course, not just the Millais Ophelia, but also Rossetti with his Lady of Shalott. This is the girl lying dead in the boat as Lancelot finds her floating into the heart of Camelot. Next. And here's Waterhouse revisiting the theme about 6 years later. This is the moment where the girl is not yet in the boat. She's actually looked away from her loom, and she's looking out the window toward handsome Lancelot riding by. We see his reflection here. He's wearing a helmet. He's very dashing, and she can no longer stand the curse. Her curse has been to weave all the things that are happening in Camelot by looking in the reflection of her mirror. She is not permitted to look at life through the window. I think you could argue that's a metaphor for women in the Victorian period, that they were not allowed to live full lives. They had to be always the mother, the daughter, the sister, never really a fully functioning citizen. And Tennyson hated that and wanted to make the point through poetry that the Lady of Shalott was someone who broke the curse by turning to look directly at her object of desire. And it ruined her. The yarns of her tapestry surround her and kill her. Essentially, they drive her into the boat, where she then begins to die. She is no longer allowed to flourish. Next. This is coming from Holman Hunt. He had thought of this motif already in the 1850s. So Waterhouse is very definitely borrowing, but making it his own. Next. And here we see Waterhouse struggling with how to get that across. Many, many drawings of this motif and how I'm going to make it most effective and compelling. Next. And this is his final attempt, very, very late in his life, where she's exhausted and half sick of shadows, and she's looking at her loom, but you can see a sideways glance. She's thinking maybe it's time to look out the window at Lancelot. Next. Ophelia emerges again, as you would expect, in Waterhouse's mind. He makes his own version in the late 1880s. This is a kind of slightly cheesy approach. It didn't actually sell because it's not that good, but you can see where he's trying to go with that lush English foliage. Next. And here is another much more successful attempt in the 1890s. Next. And a final attack in 1910, when he's much, much older. Next. Everything changes in 1890. His father dies, he comes into some serious money, he goes off to Italy for a year with his wife, and he rethinks what he wants to do. So he's got all of this stuff in the back of his mind, and he says, I want to go back at the classical inheritance and the medieval inheritance of literature, storytelling, with a fresh approach, one that is more, if you will, real, more naturalistic. And so he comes out swinging in 1891 at the Royal Academy with this extraordinary image of Ulysses on the side. I'm sure you know the story that Ulysses, on his journey home, has to sail through a dangerous passage of water where these bird women are trying to tempt him and his men. He has stopped up the men's ears so that they can't hear the beautiful singing. This is very powerful, of course, because it's not about girly girls. These are bird women. These are monsters. They have lovely faces, but they have hideous bodies. It's the
sound they make that is so delicious and would make a man go crazy. And he has, of course, tied himself to the mast so that he is able to resist their temptation. Next. He struggles like hell with his sketchbooks full of how shall I tackle this? And of course, he ultimately succeeds by zooming in like a filmmaker would in a helicopter or with a drone. Can you go back to this is like picture your favorite movie star, John Krasinski or Russell Crowe or whoever, in this role, and we're in one of those tracking shots, and here come these, really creepy women to tempt him. So I feel like he got it right, and he definitely was rewarded with much praise when this finally went on view. And next again. And he getting it from somewhere. This is not just his idea. This is a very boring drawing, but it's made by a woman called Jane Harrison. She's an important scholar that you might want to know more about. She is teaching at the British Museum, and she's looking at the objects like the siren's vase, and she's paying attention to this tradition, not of pretty sirens, but of hideous sirens. And that is the real drama, the terror that one would feel as a monster woman comes down at you, potentially to hurt you, is something that he wants to convey, not the charm of the story. This woman, Jane Harrison, as I said, well worth checking out. She writes very beautifully about the beauty of terror, the loveliness of terror. She's borrowing this idea from Shalott, the great poet, who's interested in that idea too, the romantic poet of the early 19th century. So she's reanimating that romantic idea by looking at classical objects in the British Museum. She's a real find. And she often cites the famous head of Medusa at Uffizi, the idea that this is disgusting but somehow weirdly beautiful, that Medusa was dangerous but also compelling somehow. Next. And this, to me, is a much less interesting example of a siren. This is Pointer, who's running around at the same time. She's very pretty, it's all very decorative. I'm not afraid of her. I'm not feeling anything. I'm just seeing a lovely female model in some lovely clothing. That's not what Waterhouse wants to do. He wants to do something that grabs you much more hardly. He changes that to a little later in his life. In my opinion, this is not quite as interesting. This is a very feminine-looking sailor struggling for life as the siren plays. This is part of this continuum of Ulysses. We have now the moment where he approaches the great witch, Circe. We see his reflection in the magical round mirror. Round mirrors are very present, as you can see, in this period. And she is essentially hoping to turn him into a pig, just as she has turned the sailors into pigs. He is too smart to fall for that trick, but it is an incredible composition. The way that the master here uses circle, the lion head, the ferocity of this witch, and yet, of course, she's a gorgeous woman, and one can understand why a man might be tempted to say yes. Again, a sketchbook to show us how he's struggling to find the composition. Next. A related picture, Circe, again, now she's poisoning the water in which the sailors will be swimming. This idea of a dangerous woman, femme fatale, was very common, of course, in the 1890s. We see it again and again with different authors. So Waterhouse is bringing all of that in, to be sure. But he's also now beginning to play with his technique. This is not nearly as naturalistic. This is a very generalized forest in the distance. Something is changing. He's really moving away from that straight-ahead Pre-Raphaelitism. He's thinking as well as sculpture. He, at one point, believe it or not, in his census return, calls himself a sculptist. We don't know why. We don't know what that means exactly. He definitely ran with sculptors like this, the Count, who was very talented. He comes back to Circe later in his life. A less interesting picture, I would argue, but nonetheless, she's thinking. She is in control. This is not a pawn. She is a woman who is strong and dangerous. And of course, this interest in water continues with mermaid images. Waterhouse is making very beautiful decorative necessarily one way or the other when it comes to intent. Right? The idea of transformation, however, is pertinent. The mermaid is a lady who is half woman and half fish. Again and again in the 1890s and 1900s, Waterhouse comes back to metamorphosis. And that, of course, is Ovid, the great Roman writer, who told many stories from the classical heritage of change, of transformation, physically, spiritually. Waterhouse then begins to tackle this in different ways. The naiad, of course, is a sprite of the water, usually a river or a stream. So here she is creeping out of the water, looking with much lust at this beautiful young boy who's a follower of Bacchus, according to the fur around his waist. Okay? And here's the girl emerging from the tree to have a drive. Same idea of transformation, that the woods are alive with spirits. And that is a very 1890s idea, that this notion of a generation of people who have been in some way dismayed by the discoveries of Darwin. That the Christian God is no longer what their parents thought he was. That now we have to struggle with the fact that nature shows us that the world is not biblical. And so they think about these other mythologies as pertinent. And so the idea of a tree spirit or a river spirit makes a little more sense to some people in the 1890s. This is a classic Keats tale of Alma Tottemo, the very beautiful, innocent-looking girl who tempts the knight, who is ostensibly very strong. She's a femme fatale, pure and simple. And Lamia. I showed you a drawing of Lamia before. Now here she is later. Another story from Keats. This is the temptress who, in fact, has transformed from being a snake into being a beautiful woman. And she's now about to lure the knight off in his doom. Notice that his foot, this is his foot in armor, reads as a tail on the girl. So it's very clever the way it's all put together, even though, as I said, he struggled with this one. Next. In complete contrast, we have St. Cecilia in the mid-1890s, a beautiful, decorative picture, very harmonious. This is the saint music. But, in fact, the story, the idea of Cecilia listening to magical angels playing music for her comes from Tennyson. Tennyson, the poet, writes The Palace of Art in the 1840s, and he talks about this idea of artistic beauty and this sort of transformation from the earth to higher things. And Cecilia participates in that here, of course. Next. A canonical picture of Hylas and the Nymphs. I mean, Waterhouse is really on fire now. These pictures are selling for huge prices, and they are much admired, not only in England, but also in Europe. This is the perfect mix of the semicircle, the magical number 7. There are 7 girls. They are water lilies who have transformed into human figures. They have risen to the surface of the pool. You probably know the story from ancient Greece of Hylas, the boy who's sailing around with the Argonauts, and he, in fact, comes to draw water for his fellow sailors, and he is lured into the pool, and theoretically, he is destroyed. Now, if you go to the next slide, please, you see a conventional depiction of the story of Hylas from the neoclassical artist in England. This is a little boy who obviously is being attacked by these awful, gorgeous women. This is a story of female violence. Now, please go back, if you don't mind. Here, we're not convinced at all that he's unhappy about this fate. The way he looks at these girls and the way they look at him is very lustful and gorgeous in its way. And this, I think, is an 1890s picture of pure and simple. And the fact that it is still so popular today, I think, speaks volumes about how Waterhouse gets it just right. First of all, with the composition, also the use of color. These natural colors over here, the boy in blue and red, not natural colors in this forest, right? Also, he's having fun with us because we see the stump of a tree in the background there. So we have this kind of photographic feeling, don't we? That we're sort of zooming in. The girl is cut off. The girl is cut off. It's not a bad slot. It's not great color, but it is cropped correctly. So he really is very savvy at bringing this into a filmic moment. Next. always thinking about abandonment. Now, this could be perceived as disempowering for women, but I think it's very sympathetic to these female characters. The story of Mariana from Shakespeare then is then treated by Tennyson more elaborately. Measure for Measure by Shakespeare becomes Mariana in the South by Tennyson. The girl is essentially abandoned by her lover because she has lost her dowry at sea. Her money is gone. And here she is worrying about withering away while she waits for him to return. The crack of the door should suggest that there is some hope of his return. Pandora. So we see these kneeling figures. These are seemingly needy figures. Pandora wondering what's inside the box. Please pay attention for a moment to the rising sun that appears on the end of the casket that she's about to open. That's something we'll come back to. There's a reason that there's a rising sun there. Venus awakening Adonis. As you know, the myth of spring is here. The slumbering winter is over, and now it's springtime. A weird story to treat, very unusual for the British. Two lovely young women notice that there is a human head floating in the water. Whose head is that? It's Orpheus. Orpheus has been dismembered by angry women because he won't sleep with them. He loves his own wife too much. And so here he is floating down bit by bit. We see his heart, his lyre, with his head. Could you go to the next slide, please? The head is very beautiful, in fact. It's actually very feminine rather than masculine, with flowers and so on. So, very strange picture, but it is quite haunting and memorable. I think I showed you a drawing of this figure before, the Dahesh. These are the sisters, a large number of sisters, who murdered their husbands on the wedding night because they didn't want to get married. And they are cursed forever to pour water into a pot which has no bottom. Essentially, this will be the forever kind of curse. Obviously, it's a wonderful opportunity to show the female body arching, but it also is a little bit depressing to think about women and their fate. Why is Waterhouse showing these stories of women abandoned or cursed? That's a question. We don't really know, but he obviously is aware of classical myth. This is a myth from Greece. And the famous story of Psyche and Cupid, this crazy lumber bear that they have, she's looking into a golden box that she should not be looking into, rather like Pandora. Echo and Narcissus, the idea of love that will never be attained. This girl is hopelessly in love with Narcissus, and where she will fade away into just being an echo, and he will become the Narcissus flower because he's so self-absorbed he can't feed himself. Okay? Now I am turning. I'm coming to the end here, I promise. The idea that Waterhouse, circa 1908, 1909, becomes noticeably interested in images of women picking flowers. Now, it's not going to surprise you to hear that because there are flowers all over the pictures I've been showing you, but there's something extra about this, and this is one of the earlier pictures of that kind. It seems innocuous enough. It's obviously an Italian landscape. You can tell that from the trees. This one happens to have an arched top, which makes it feel like a Renaissance altarpiece. It's lovely coloring, a little bit handy as far as I'm concerned, but nonetheless, this is very much typical Edwardian scene. We're now in 1909. He's an old man now. He is 60, and he is, not making exciting, cutting-edge pictures anymore. The market has changed. We have the arrival of movies. People are not going to the picture galleries as much as they used to. They're going to the cinema. But nonetheless, he's still doing fine. Next. This lady comes along. Now, we don't know much about her. She's a bit of a mystery. Notice I have her birth date, but not her death date. She's a writer, and she's a thinker. And I need to know more about her. I hope you can help me with that. She writes a very interesting, long article about Waterhouse in 1909, which is published in a major journal. And he says all sorts of interesting things. And I just realized my phone is back there. I'm going to come back here. I'm sorry to do this to you, but I want to read you something rather interesting. Thank you. I put it on my phone. Come on, if I can find my glasses. She writes in the article to make him seem cooler than he is, but I don't think so. I think he sort of has nothing to lose. I think that he's talking with her openly in his studio about things that really matter to him. And I'll just quote a few of her lines. Full comprehension of this art is reserved for those alone who can feel the action of the spirit through the shaped course of Greek myth and medieval romance. Okay. In other words, it's an elite pursuit to like his art, not a popular pursuit. And that's true. He was no longer popular in the same way he once had been. Now, she also talks about the last poem of living paganism, The Rape of Persephone, which was written in the manner of Ovid. We've heard about Ovid already, by a guy called Claudian. Now, Claudian, as it happens, was a black propagandist from Honorius. Do you remember Honorius, the emperor beating his birds? Claudian was his court writer. And Claudian wrote The Rape of Persephone. And it's interesting because The Rape of Persephone was a Latin text that had not yet been translated into English as it is today. So it means that Waterhouse and Rose Sketchley had read that text in Latin. And that's pretty nerdy, by 1909. So what's that all about? Now, if we think about what's in The Rape of Persephone, if you go back up, please, to the previous slide, the story is, you probably know from Greek myth, that Persephone is a beautiful girl who's picking flowers in Sicily, theoretically alone, but not necessarily. She might have had a girlfriend with her. And she's abducted by Hades and brought down to hell. And essentially, there she is as the bride of hell. And she's not happy about it. She's miserable. And her mother, Demeter, who is the queen of agriculture, says, I'm not having this, and we're going to figure something out. I want my daughter to come back to the surface for half the year, and she can be in hell the rest of the year, right? Well, that's how we have seasons. That's what the Greeks would have us believe. So this is fraught. This is about seasonality. This is about life and death. Because nature dies in winter and comes back to life in the spring, kind of like Venus kissing the Adonis, right? So something's going on here. And so we have Rose Sketchley. So go forward, please. Again. Now, there's a heritage to this, by the way. Frederick Sanders, you've seen him already, is very interested in gentle spring. Notice that this beautiful figure with the rainbow is crushing flowers under her feet as she walks. So she's gentle, but she's not that gentle. So there is a kind of double edge to this whole rotundity thing. Okay? Burne Jones, the great Pre-Raphaelite, also had been thinking about women eating flowers. I mean, it's a beautiful motif of a lovely woman bending over to pick a flower, but it's more than that. Okay? And here's Walter Crane thinking about the story of Persephone as well. But this is a very unpleasant picture because she literally is being carried off by the god of hell in a helmet. That's not very nice. Okay? And Rosetta, of course, thinking about Persephone with her pomegranate. That's the symbol of the girl. Okay? Well, here's where it starts to get interesting. Essentially, what we find out is that Persephone was also of great interest to Tennyson. And the only two books that we have today from Warehouse's library are Shelley and Tennyson. That's interesting. That somehow those came down from the family and nothing else did. Here is Waterhouse drawing on his own copy of Tennyson, The Girl Picking Flowers. Obviously, this matters to him, and he's been reading Tennyson, who wrote about it too. Next. And now we start to think a little more complicatedly about that rising sun that you saw on the casket for Pandora. This is a sketch that Waterhouse makes of a girl looking at a rising or a setting sun. I'm not sure which it is. He's interested in that motif. Next. A little close-up of the sun. Big deal. Next. Well, more interestingly, in 1913, he designs a tombstone for his best friend who's died. And there's the rising sun. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was a secret society active in Victoria's and Edwardian Britain. Elite people, artists, scholars, and so on, who believed in other belief systems. Let's just say that they didn't go to church much anymore. And they got together quietly, and they would talk about ancient rituals, and they would actually perform some. And they were very knowledgeable about the classical past. And their symbol was the rising sun. And here is it seems to me that notion of something is going on here, and it's shot through all of the work, is relevant, and sketchily hints on it. You go to the next one, please. Yeah. Very interesting to G.F. Watts, the great Royal Life Commission, really thinking about this kind of fusion of the elements all in one. The flora and zephyrs, the idea of abduction is present already in Waterhouse's work. This girl is being lifted away by the god, the west wind, and his man friends. The girls, as you can see, are surrounded by whirling drapery because they're afraid she's being abducted. But this is not anything particularly new for Waterhouse. Now we have this whole cycle of girls in nature who are somehow engaged with flowers. And what Sketchley tells us is that there is this linkage of water and earth, and in particular, the analogy between the unfolding of the roads through earth and of the soul through suffering. She talks about nature as a process of the soul, a shrine when, at last, the soul has found its stillness between the changing appearances of the body. The changing appearances of the body. We've been looking at transformations all along. So the idea that this is a journey that we take. As flowers, as human beings, as elements, we're going through difficulties to get to the other side. And that, I think, is deeply powerful because I think Waterhouse was not well by this period. He had some sort of health issue. He dies in 1917, but by all accounts, it was a long illness. So he's starting to think about mortality and about the fact that beauty and suffering are interconnected. So if you'll just move through these, please. We have these, rather samey looking pictures of girls in nature, but notice it's wind. Now, another abduction. Sorry, go ahead. The familiar story of Paul and Daphne, where he's chasing the girl and she turns into a tree. That is also part of the idea of chase and abduction. Obviously borrowing clearly from Bernini and his famous sculpture of the same motif. Another chakra. Next. Girl picking flowers. So now let's remember that these pictures were meant to be distributed all around the world. They were never meant to be seen on the slide screen in Philadelphia at the same time. So we may find them a little bit samey, but the fact is that they were important to him, and he's actually selling them to various people who find them lovely as well. So as pretty as they might be, I think they also are charged with this extra awareness of the interconnectivity of beauty, of flowers blooming, and decay. Next. Same idea, right here. These are really beautiful pictures, I must say. I mean, I don't mean to be cruel about the pretty part. The colors are delicious, and obviously you've got real joy of handling. When you come up close to these, you see such lively brushstrokes. Next. Again, another. This is more interesting to some of us because we see how he's working with the body before he puts the drapery on top. Next. A little bit different here with children in the mix. The idea of the next generation, fertility. Next. And interestingly, his only Christian image, the Annunciation, comes at this time. The idea of a supernatural miracle of a young woman looking very much like his favorite model, who is experiencing this miraculous discovery. It is a very strange and, weird encounter that she has with this kind of ghost. Now, all of a sudden, without having sex, she's pregnant. What's that all about? That is definitely something that's on his mind at this point. Next. And in fact, another transformation of a different kind, medieval heritage here, the famous story celebrated by Wagner, Tristan and Isolde, the potion that will transform them into lovers. And finally, Dante, very exciting. He's starting to think about the heritage of Dante. And that too involves flowers. This is the Matilda figure, but less familiar to us today than Beatrix. But this idea of a mysterious woman who is leading him on, who is essentially pointing to a new direction. This is all tied together, this encyclopedic reading that he's doing and why he's finding these specific themes and pulling them out to paint as opposed to others that might be more spectacular. Like, for example, in Dante, something quite awful, like a particular ring of the Inferno. He's not doing that. Next. I'm now working on this artist, Charles Sims. Sims was a student at Waterhouse at the Royal Academy Schools and went on to do really interesting work, including this. This is a kind of idyllic picture of women and children in nature. It's a little hard to see in this slide, but it's actually quite delicious. And it's in Tate, the National Collection. He was very well known. And then he kind of went to pieces in the 1920s because his kind of art was out of fashion. And he ultimately killed himself in the late 1920s. This is the next step. This is the next generation. And there's a lot of interesting work that he produced. I feel like we do a disservice to the Victorians when we look at them as only storytellers, that we need to dig a layer down and say, why are they telling these stories? And why did those stories matter so much to them? And Waterhouse is a great example of that. Thank you for listening. Sorry, I was terribly long, but I just had a lot to say. If you have any questions, I'm glad to take them, or we can talk a little bit later.
How did John Singer Sargent play into this whole world of the Pre-Raphaelites and
Yeah. Sargent was very much a peer. He and Waterhouse would have been in the same meetings of the governing council of the Royal Academy. As you know, Sargent lived in London and knew everybody.
what year did he move from Paris to London?
Early 1880s. So he is rising in London as Waterhouse is rising. And in fact, I think they might have joined the Academy the same year. But I'd have to go back and check, but I used to know the answer to that. They are close in age. Sargent is about 7 years younger than Waterhouse. But of course, Sargent was a whiz kid and was always ahead of his generation. That he was always the bright young man. And it wouldn't be surprising that he gets to the finish line at the same time as an older man. I think that Sargent is brilliant, of course, but we don't see evidence of him dealing with these poetic themes, these mythological themes, anywhere as deeply. And I don't mean to be superficial, I just mean that I think he's got a different vision, a different project. And of course, after 1909, when he gravitates entirely to non-portraiture, when he says, that's it, I'm done, I've made enough money, I'm going to paint what I want to paint. Even then, he's pretty much describing the world that we see rather than imagining lost worlds of the past. So there's overlap stylistically, but I wouldn't say emotionally. I think they're built very differently, those two men. And there's no evidence that they were friendly, like they were colleagues, but they weren't necessarily friends. So, yes.
It's interesting that Waterhouse used so much story, because story have things out before and have them after. And even in his remarks, but his photographic vernacular that he's painting, like throws in more space for depth and off screen. And I also think so much about him calling himself a sculptor. He showed that the similarity of some of the things to sculpture. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between sculpture and poetry versus storytelling and music, which is they can't really, if time isn't quite the same medium as it is for story and music, but he seems very much interested in transformation in before and after, and is that common for that era? Is that it seems to change in his life a little bit. He's painting toward the end don't have the same like the moment isn't as poignant. But yeah. How does he see time?
I totally agree with that. His challenge is that he is a professional painter seeking to exhibit every summer at the great exhibition of the Royal Academy. He's not making films, because films haven't really been perfected yet. That only really occurs in the super late 1890s and beyond. He's just a little too old to go to that technology. My point in mentioning that he has to do a snapshot because that's what the market demands. He's going to sell something in a gold frame, and it's going to be whatever it's going to be, and we're not going to get part 2 or part -1 because he just can't deliver that. That's not what the market wants. It's interesting that there really aren't, for example, triptychs in that period for sale. That you could make a triptych, right, before, during, and after transformation. Say, hey, that doesn't happen because the market is not built that way in England at that time. Therefore, I would argue that he's capturing earlier in his career, when he's better, the more pregnant moments, those really meaningful snapshots of change. And one example could be, if you wish, the idea of Hylas and the Nymphs. That gaze, that the boy and girl exchange, is that moment of we're not sure what's happening anymore. That the traditional telling of abduction, of violence, of ruin, no more, because this looks like a two-way street. And that is something very well executed, and well conceived, and believe me, he struggled to get there. Let's go a little further and think about something like, I suppose you could talk about the Circe pictures. That those are, we're not quite sure. That is Ulysses going to go with it or resist? And that is a moment of tension that's dramatic. And I didn't have time to get into theater. We have no evidence that Waterhouse worked in theater like Alma Tottemo did, i.e. designing sets. But we can be sure he went to look, because theater was booming in Victorian London, and there were lots of great shows to see. And so we do sense a bit of the ethicality, especially in certain pictures like Mary Anthony, where she's very consciously a stage actress, like Sarah Bernhardt walking down the stairs. That is something he decides not to pursue. I would say that sculpture is also hemmed in by this challenge that you have to, in one go, get it. And of course, I think we all agree that Bernini does it incredibly well with Apollo Death. That is one of the most extraordinary sculptures in the world at the Borghese Gallery, because it's all happening in marble. I would argue that Waterhouse's picture of Apollo Death is not nearly as successful. It feels like an illustration. It feels very flat. And even though there's a lot of movement, it doesn't feel compelling. And I think that's because he's losing some steam by that point in his career. I would argue that at that point, he realizes his problem, and he starts shifting toward the flower-picking girls, because they're much more static. They're not as needing to be convincing, because dynamism is not the point. The picking of flowers is a relatively slow motion activity. And so they look gorgeous because they're right. They are believable and convincing. Coming back to your bigger point about storytelling and how do you choose which medium you're going to pursue, movies kill it. This art dies a painful and quick death in the first decade of the 20th century. The Royal Academy is the most popular visual festival in Victorian Britain in the 1880s and 1890s. By 1905, 1907, it's like an echo chamber, because everyone's in the movies, because they're enthralled by motion picture. They don't need to watch a still picture anymore. They can watch a motion picture of the same stories that we're talking about. Tempest, Apollo Daphne, you name it. And movies were all over Britain by 1910. And so that is a challenge for these guys. And one could argue that it's Waterhouse's good luck that he died in 1917, when, World War I was underway, nobody was paying attention. I mean, he was sort of ignored. I mean, there was not much notice of his death in 1917, because the newspapers were filled with the names of dead young men coming home from Flanders and France. I mean, that was an awful situation. Millions of people died. My guy, Charles Sims, the one I'm working on now, lived too long, and he finally has to kill himself. I don't mean he has to, but he feels that he has to in the late 1920s, because he's just all washed up. He doesn't know how to play in this new world of visuality. He certainly is not going to be a filmmaker. So this is really human stuff we're talking about. And it's complicated. And I'm not passing judgment on anyone's decision, they are doing what they need to do, or nature is taking its course in the case of illness. Does that help in any way? I hope so. Yes.
What do we know about his favorite model and his ideas on human ideal beauty, aesthetics?
Well, there have been huge rows over the last 25 years about the models. Who are they? Can we find their names? In some sketchbooks, there are names written, and we try to match them up, and we have failed. There's one couple, married couple in Texas, who argue that the most visible model of the mature years is called Muriel Foster. And there was a real model called Muriel Foster in London. We can't be sure that that's her. I think that the evidence is a bit thin, and I'm not really invested. I don't have a strong opinion on this. I believe that Waterhouse and his generation are often improving their models, that they might have a lovely young woman for them, and she may stick with them for many years because she's a great poser, and she's a lovely person, and she is a bright price. But they're kind of making tweaks to reflect their ideal beauty. And Burne Jones would be the most extreme example, in my opinion. Every Burne Jones woman looks like every other Burne Jones woman, because that's what he loves, that's what he wants to look at. Waterhouse is a little more different. I think we see some stylistic, different skin tones and different hair colors and different body types and so on as the years go by. But certainly that mature red-headed model seems to be very common in the 1890s and 1900s. He never wrote about this issue. We only have sketchbooks, and even then we have spotty sketchbooks. Certain years are missing completely, and others we have plenty. So that's just bad luck. No one wrote about this, by the way, in terms of like a rose sketchly. No one said, well, Waterhouse thinks that this kind of woman is beautiful. But nobody actually got that out of it. So we have to just read the pictures.
You guys talked about the influence of both Alma Tottemo and like the discovery of Pompeii around that time. And I'm just like you did those stories about Alma Tottemo going to Pompeii, like measure and everything. And I'm just wondering if Waterhouse was as obsessed with the researcher.
Great question. No. We have no evidence that Waterhouse took as much interest in the details. I think that he, in my mind, is more poet and less scientist than Tottemo. Tottemo is really a scientist and an archaeologist, really interested in the nitty-gritty, and we can prove that through the archives of his drawings. I mean, he kept a library not only of books and photographs, but also of his own drawings of artifacts, and it is like a museum. Now at the University of Birmingham, you can go consult it anytime you want. Waterhouse has no such collection, and if he had, we would have known about it. Somebody would have mentioned it somewhere, but he didn't. I think he had to go to the all the time. I think this guy loved to read and was constantly reading poetry and plays, and maybe going to attend plays and traveling to places like Pompeii and Capri, but absorbing, not really writing all the details down. I'm sure he bought souvenirs. I'm sure that he went to the British Museum to check a few artifacts just to make sure he had it right. But toward the later years, I think you agree, things look a lot more generalized, right? That unlike Alma Tottemo, who never lets go of the accuracy, we see Waterhouse from the 1890s onward starting to loosen up and not be so archaeological. And by the end, it's just flowers. I mean, you could paint those in a park in London. You don't have to go to Italy to see those. So, as it happens, he kept going to Italy all his life, and he also went into the English countryside a lot with his dear friends to enjoy the weather. So, it's maddening, of course, because we would love to have more records of him checking in at the British Museum Library or going on a tour with Jane Harrison. We don't have that. And with Tottemo, we do. Yes?
How did you get interested in Waterhouse, and what resources have you uncovered for you to share?
Well, I, in graduate school in London in the early 90s, I thought it was fascinating as we were being taught about this period thought that was kind of cool and cosmopolitan. And I was doing a program that was all about the interconnections of London and Paris. And I thought, well, here's somebody who embodies that in many ways, because, you know, you had to be an idiot not to pay attention to modern French art in the 1880s and 1890s. I mean, it was so exciting what the French were doing. And obviously, he was paying attention. And he was drinking it in and making it his own. You would never confuse his art with French artists of the same period. It's his. And the English loved that about him. They said, well, you know, he's sort of French only to a point. And we like that. I think that what I found was that the biography from 1980 by Tony Hobson, whom I never met, unfortunately he died before I had a chance to meet him, was good but not helpful enough. I thought it wasn't contextualizing enough. It was a very good birth to death biography, but it wasn't really pushing out and looking at some other stuff going on around this man. And now I'm sure I've read another book by someone else because more research has occurred and I'm not part of that necessarily because I've been distracted with some other things. I think this guy is well worth the trouble because the art is so, you can feel that it is authentic and meaningful to him. It doesn't feel industrial. And by the way, he didn't paint that much relative to some of his peers. We have in total about 350 objects from him. And I'm talking about oil paintings, finished and unfinished, and major drawings. That's not much. I mean, if you look at someone like Leighton or Chapman, we're talking like thousands. So it's a whole different energy. And I think part of it is because he's slow and organized. And part of it is because he's just really thinking about it. And he doesn't have to paint for a family. He has no children. You know, he can go off on holiday with his wife and have a nice time. They're not really worried about putting the kids through school. So it's a different energy. And he's got his nose in the book. So I love that. I think that's kind of fun. It sounds like a good life. By the way, up until that house that I showed you in St. John's Wood, they rented. They didn't even own. And that was highly unusual, you know, for that period. I mean, he had money. But they were like, whatever. You know, they finally got a fancy house. But I think they probably did it just because. Okay, well, thank you for listening. Oh, sorry. Yes, I'll tell you. The question is about landscape in England. It was all about his dear friend that he made a tombstone for. That was his brother-in-law. Esther, his wife, had a sister, and she married an artist called Phoebe, and that was Phoebe's tombstone in Suffolk. Phoebe was very rich. His father and his family owned a major newspaper in Birmingham, which was a rich city at that time. The couple, Phoebe's, who had no children, by the way, had home first in Devon, north Devon, sort of near Bristol, like just south of Bristol, if you can picture that. And then they moved to a house in East Anglia, in Norfolk, which is very flat. And those are two very different areas, right? I mean, stylistically, like one is very hilly and one is very flat. But, you know, they were in the fields and they were in the meadows and they were, you know, making sketches and drawings and paintings of, you know, flowers and trees and things. As you can see, this guy is obsessed with trees. There's absolutely no question about that. He's constantly sketching trees. And that would absolutely tap into the spiritual thing about the suffering, the idea that a tree is in the air, in the earth, and below. That there's this kind of multi-level aspect to trees that I think that generation found very interesting. So he wanted to be here, great trees. And he wants to. Okay. Oh, okay. Yes. Not really. No. The question is about influence today. You know, I think there are great artists working today in this realm of storytelling, but not in this terrain of poetic. And I don't quite know why. I guess part of that is that we're living in a more cynical age and people are more wary of looking sentimental or dopey. I think, you know, and that's the problem. You know, that some of the people that we admire perhaps at the super expensive level these days, like John Curran, who's a very good painter, always with a kind of irony. You know, it's Dutch Van is painting fake modern, and it is very expert, but it's also quite cynical and not especially uplifting. So this is meant to be uplifting, but that's what he's after here, as well as touching.
I was just wondering, like, what the seminary that says gold, a lot of gold, who was in Brooklyn, you don't think he had people, what is it?
Not Brad Hergel?
Yes.
Okay, sure.
Right, and then a lot of pictures of women, maybe lying down.
Oh, I see. I see what you
And
mean.
I think that's Waterhouse, or do you think that's just completely a coincidence?
That's a really interesting point about Brad. I just saw some work at Philadelphia Fine Art Fair, which we're going to, by the way, at 23rd Street Armory. It's interesting. A lot of his work is there. I don't know Brad personally. I admire his work that we covered it in the 19. My sense is that he's more interested in visuality than in the meaning beneath. Like, it's gorgeous and it's Ophelia and it's romantic and it's nature and woman together, and those are all good things, but it's not necessarily about a narrative or a symbolism. And I'm thinking some of the other artists in that terrain. You know, I'll be very frank with you, especially the ladies. This whole thing about women drowning, like this whole phase of artists making Ophelia pictures of women drowning and suffocating in flowers, that is creepy stuff. I mean, I understand the beauty of the Millais painting. It is extraordinary, but I should write an article about how many dozens of artists are bringing up that motif, and I just find that deeply troubling. And with male artists primarily, but there's some female artists too. I'd love to have a conversation about that at some point with women artists, because I think, you know, what is that all about? And I'm not even trying to be a Me Too about it. I just, even 10 years ago, I was struck by how prevalent that imagery is. And, you know, Millais is doing it to make the point that this is a tragedy. This is not just beautiful. This is wrong. Hamlet did wrong and made her go mad. And that underlying meaning is vanished from a lot of these decorative pictures that I see, which is really not cool. That's my point. Preaching.